We are live on air with the October 30th out-of-band meeting of the Node.js modules team. We have 9 individuals on the call, including 8 voting members of the modules team, meaning we have consensus. The high-level purpose of this meeting is, hoping to reach consensus around what we need to do to move things forward and get an unflagged version of modules out of the door. Oh, we've got another attendee. It's Jordan again. We had a meeting last week where we discussed a couple different things, and we were trying to get consensus around stuff such as the new proposal for let's just see. We got through self-reference. We wanted to talk, I guess, more about the divergent specifier hazard as well as conditional exports. And then we want to talk about, I guess, the timeline for getting things out the door. And then, I guess, reaching consensus. So got 4 things on the agenda right now. Is there anything that folks think we should add that's not in that list? Jan, you have your hand up?
Just to clarify, for example, a conditional exports proposal, I'm assuming that implies that for unflagging, exports would be unflagged. For example, is that correct?
I don't think that it necessarily implies that, although I think that is something that we maybe need to reach consensus on. So maybe a good thing for us to start with right now before we get into the particular issues would be to tease apart the things that we want to try to reach consensus on. So I'm just going to enumerate a couple thoughts and then just raise your hand or even, feel free to chime in or add to the doc if you have anything to add. So one of the things I feel like we need to reach consensus on, kind of independent of the conditional exports proposal, would be if we want to allow the divergent specifier hazard. Does anyone disagree that that's something we need to reach consensus on? Okay, then another thing we need to reach consensus on is landing conditional exports proposal. And kind of sub things here would be behind a flag and whether this blocks unflagging. And then I guess also if we want to, and this is tied to the above, allowing multiple entry points in Node.js runtime. Anything people disagree with that, or is there anything that people...
Could I just clarify that wording? I would consider the exports proposal to be a multi-entry point proposal. So when, an entry point being an entry point into a package. So I prefer to just
is that a good clarification?
Multiple
maybe multiple specifier resolutions.
Yeah, I mean the main point is I don't know. So I think the divergent specifier hazard is that between different environments. I'm not sure that's something in control because someone can write a custom resolver which supports any other entry point. So yeah, I sort of think of it as like environment conditions or environment specific entry point mappings. Or sorry, I don't mean to be difficult on the terminology, but just trying to be clear.
Do you like how I did it now? Allow multiple entry point mappings for a module main in default Node.js resolver? Or is that just like too much word salad?
Yeah, I think maybe conditional mappings even carries enough of the meaning to just use the conditional term again.
Okay, but I mean, like, isn't that the whole proposal?
Yeah, exactly.
Because I guess like there could be value in supporting the proposal with like the sugar of the object instead of an array with an object as the first item, independent of whether or not we allow multiple mappings to a single specifier.
Right.
Let's just leave it for now.
Okay.
We can bike shit up.
Get hung up on terminology. Sorry.
Yeah.
There.
Wesley, you have a comment there. Part of the conditional export implementation at this point, I'm with supporting default path alongside path, but not using it for multi-entry. Okay, so let's dig into that specific bit in the discussion. Do you think that we're Wesley? Do you think there's something that's missing in that list of consensus that we should include, or do you think that we've covered that?
Well, yeah, like the conditional exports PR as it is today can be separated out into two separate features. One, adding support for using an object with a default field for that points at a string or array or whatever that can take the place of the string. And then two, layered on top of that, also supporting a module member of that object that's used as an alternative entry point for things. Like the first part I can be on board with, like that's been explained. I can understand how that can benefit the community independent of the second part.
Okay, so alternative entry points for a single specifier?
Within a single runtime.
No, not within a single runtime.
Oh, I'm just saying like that's the point we need to reach consensus on, like whether or not we want to allow that.
Right. I mean, like, yeah.
Okay, cool. So then I guess then the last is that we need to start to reach consensus upon would be unflagging. And like what features need to be unflagged first? And I guess like Jordan, you have the like dual mode modules.
Yeah, so I guess I was kind of assuming that was part of the conditional exports discussion, but yeah, the really it's probably better to call that out explicitly.
Yeah, I'm just trying to like tease all these things separately. Like similarly also about like the divergent specifier hazard, which I'm like trying to tease out separately as well from the alternative entry points, because this is more about like the specific implementation within this proposal versus like the overall hazard versus like the feature set and behavior that like, so they are kind of different. They're all intertwined, but we can maybe talk about them slightly.
Yeah, totally. That sounds fine.
Okay, Jeffrey, you have your hand up.
Sorry, I was just going to ask Wes if he had seen the thing I posted online about the what I call dual package hazard. I can post into the. Some reason it's not letting me paste into chat right now, but it's.
Yeah, it's just a rehash of what was said in the pull request that tries to make something into a bigger issue than it is. I know. Yeah.
Okay, so with that, is there anything else that we can think of other than this list? I guess timeline. Is there anything other than the list that we have in reaching consensus that we're going to attempt to sort through today, or alternatively, blocks? Actually, you know what? I want to add one thing here based on the other things that we talk about, which would be continuing activity of the group. And we can get to that one last, but I do think that we should find some time to talk about it, because if we do find, or maybe also like ways to move forward, because there is a distinct risk today that if we are unable to reach some degree of consensus on this stuff, we may have actually found the one final thing that is an absolute deadlock for us. And so if we are unable to work through that in today's discussion, I think it would be reasonable for us to save maybe even the last 20 or 30 minutes of the meeting to go through thinking about what we want to do, if we want to continue working as a group on this, if we want to vote, which I would prefer not to, but just kind of like, how do we find a way forward? Because we've had multiple meetings about this. And if after today's meeting, we are still in a deadlock about these particular issues, I don't know that it's the best use of anyone's time to continue to have these meetings. Jan?
Not a direct follow-up for that, but for the what features need to be unflagged first, I think there is should we add an open questions for unflagging those as separate items? So background for me asking about this stuff is there's still at least one question unanswered for unflagging exports, for example. Like if we would want to unflag exports right now, there's one open question that would need to be decided before we can actually do that. So if we say
we've already landed the PR for unflagging exports, so it would actually have to be a consideration of reflagging.
Well, we unflagged it, but then reflagged it under modules.
Yeah, but I think the intention of that with removing that flag was that when the modules flag is removed, exports gets automatically unflagged. Like I was under the impression that for the baseline exports proposal, we had already reached consensus on unflagging that.
Right. There's a single issue left around how to treat Windows-style path segments in exports, whereas right now there's an open issue. So if exports is rolled into modules unflagging, then that is an open issue for modules unflagging.
Okay, so then maybe we should just add one real quick one here as well about whether or not we need to reflag exports. And I'll just add...
Or maybe do you just want to add that specific concern as well to the discussion?
Yeah, for the discussion, I will add Windows, Windows path separators.
In package names or relative specifiers, yeah?
I'll just say in export maps.
In specifiers.
Okay. I think I have the answer to that, although people may not like it. Don't support them.
Yes, that is my current position as well.
Or at least we can don't not support them right now and unflag and then deal with adding support later.
By that you mean like throw if they're found in the specifier?
No, right now the behavior is that they are ignored. Exports does not consider them valid.
Ah, okay.
Export does not apply if there's a Windows style specifier after the package name.
So since this seems like a primarily technical discussion and less fraught with violent disagreement, although perhaps I will be pleasantly surprised by how angry we get about this. But maybe we should start with this one because it seems pretty well scoped. Jan, is there anything else you wanted to add about this?
I just linked the issue in the reflag exports item, and I can also post it in the chat, which might be easier. Yeah, it's a relatively narrow thing, and for me, it also rolls into things like, in theory, you can, for example, on a case-insensitive file system, again, something platform specific, you can circumvent certain export restrictions, because if you specifically exported a directory but then unexported a specific file, which works, if you then use a case variant of that file in your specifier, you can circumvent that. But for me, that's the kind of platform-specific behavior that I would like to just say, we ignore that. Like if you write platform-specific code, exports might not catch certain attempts to get at files. So kind of also in the line of exports was never meant to be a 100% secure thing. There is ways of getting to these files anyhow. So us trying to lock it down against all kind of edge cases on different platforms and file systems seems prone to fail.
So I guess the question is, if you're in that situation, you would have the only way to actually keep that file, like when you're trying to essentially negate a, what is it? So you say you export the whole directory and then you want to unexport a file within it. The only way to block that would be to have every casing permutation explicitly blocked. Is that right?
Or be on Linux where casing matters.
No, right. But if you wanted to block it for users of a case-insensitive file system.
Yeah.
So for most, like, would it be, how hard would it be to just say, like,
we are talking about a case.
Casings?
We are currently talking about cases where people are actively trying to get to these files, ignoring the readmes, because the readme will not contain a backslash. The readme will not contain a different casing of the file. So people are pretty much already trying to get around the exports restrictions. And once they are in that situation, they can just path resolve and require or import the file system URL. Like,
so I think that
easier ways
Wes's
around
point in chat is really the thing, is that the concern is not about people trying to be malicious, because they can always fs.read file sync or whatever. Like this is accidents. So I guess what I mean is if somebody accidentally writes code that while they happen to be on a case insensitive file system that works because of this, and then they ship it to a case sensitive file system, it will suddenly break, and not in a way that they can debug. Like that would be the hazard I would be concerned about, not someone trying to pry in.
Right,
is
but
there
that's
a way
already
we can
true for all current requires and imports.
So I guess with that, the left-hand side of the exports map, right? Like people are going to put a specific casing in there. Could we just force a direct match, in which I'm assuming is what happens today, of like whatever they put into the importer require statement must match with case sensitivity, independent of the system they're on, how the export is named? Like wouldn't catching it kind of earlier just prevent that thing from happening? And I think that, tell me if I'm wrong, that seems to be what you might be suggesting.
Right now we do exact matches on the left-hand side, which I think is the only thing we can do. Anything else would us having opinions on whether you can have a case-sensitive file system or whether you can use backslashes. So on the left-hand side, we just do purely equality of the string without any considerations around platform differences on file systems, because on the left-hand side, file systems do not exist, platforms do not exist. It's just specifier matching. The case-sensitive thing is specifically for the edge case where someone exports a whole directory and then unexports a specific file.
But could we make it so in that case, if you export the whole directory, you're not just saying, okay, now you have access to the file system. You are instead saying, let's get the exact casing. Oh, because there isn't an exact casing on insensitive file systems to pick, huh?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think there will always be platform-specific things that will, in quotation marks, circumvent exports. But it's always cases where people will realistically have no editor autocomplete. They ignored the documentation and wrote something from memory, which means that they are not necessarily the absolute beginners. So I have a hard time saying, yes, we should add more complexity to our implementation and pretend like we can actually address all of these things without a lot of code. And it's all things that kind of already exist in the existing system. It's not like this is a big regression where the existing system wouldn't have issues with case sensitive files. Like I'm pretty sure that there already is the case that you can have Node code that works well on macOS and fails on Linux because suddenly case sensitive file systems are a thing.
Wesley, you seem to have a bunch of ideas in the chat. Do you want to chime in? Oh, on a train. Okay, classic train. Okay, so I'm going to read Wes's comment then. This is caused by a mismatch between what you want to expose and what's being checked. You want to expose specific cache entries, specific things a specifier can resolve to, not a specific casing of a path. So Wesley, and if you respond in the chat, I'll read it. Like, do you have a particular solution that you can imagine to this space that can help with that? Well, right now, exports only operate over resolved path, says Wes. So, I mean, if we deferred it a bit to operate over cache entries and mark specific ones as exposed. But I guess, Wesley, my thought there is like, not all of these entries are in the cache yet at the time that they're required, right?
Well, the other thing is that on a case insensitive system, if you have a file name that's foo.js, let's say, you don't know, you have no information about what the casing should be, as my understanding. Like, we can't look at it and say, oh, it's supposed to be capital F, lowercase o, and therefore, like, so I guess that's what I'm looking for confirmation from that, perhaps from Jan as well. Like, if that's information we can get, then my hope would be that we can just say, okay, cool, that's the only casing that's allowed, even on a case insensitive system, even when you're exporting a whole directory. But if you can't get that information, then there's no way to know.
Yeah, and also that node behavior would then be platform dependent, 100%. Like, the same code, Node would do different things for the same code depending on the platform. Because on Linux, having foo all lowercase and foo all uppercase in the same directory is completely valid. So if you require uppercase O, lowercase o, uppercase o, Node cannot choose one or the other.
Well, sorry, what I mean is on a case insensitive system, like, the file names and the requested file name, the actual file name and requested file name are normalized and matched, right, to some degree. And what I'm saying is that on a case sensitive file system, yes, you can have all caps foo and all lowercase foo. But I guess what I mean is both of those, like, we could take the file system platform dependent part out of it and just say, if the actual files in the folder are capital foo and lowercase foo, then those are the exact casing specifiers you can reach. And if you do capital F, lowercase o, there's nothing there. So in other words, that wouldn't be different across platforms. That would be the same across platforms. It would just mean that some of your case insensitivity expectations would not apply, but that's fine. Is that possible?
I'm going to interrupt for 1 second just with a thought, and we can continue if people want. We are at 1:34 right now, and we have a lot to get through. This feels potentially also like it's an issue that goes broader than our implementation and even exports, because it explicitly affects the required JS loader as well. So I would like to suggest that potentially we treat this as out of scope for our implementation, even for exports. And if we need to fix behavior, we need to fix consistent behavior in the entire runtime, not only in exports. And this likely will involve a Semver major change against Node Core. One thing, for example, that I think is worth considering here is, like, I just did a quick test locally on a case-insensitive file system for macOS, and I created a module foo with capital F. I required foo with an underscore F, then required it again with the capital F, and then both console logged __ dir name, and both of them have the casing that I fed to it. So Wesley, to even like the question that you were asking there, even from the cache entries, I believe the cache entry is going to have the casing of what you've required, and it will just work when it fetches the resource from the file system. It doesn't actually get the proper casing. So it would be a pretty big, like my intuition here is that this is a non-trivial change to Node core itself to get what we may consider to be good behavior. For anyone who's following along and not watching the chat, I think Wesley's head just exploded. Does anyone object to then just moving forward on this, and at least like we can revisit it quickly during the consensus to make sure that we're on the same page. Everyone cool with that? Okay, cool. So the next thing that we're on is the divergent specifier hazard. Jeff, you've done a lot of work documenting this, and then you've also done work documenting the other hazard. Do you want to give just like a quick overview again of the initial hazard, and then the new hazard that you've documented as well, potentially even presenting the screen so folks can see stuff?
Sure. I just shared the link again. Let me pull it up, and I can share. Okay, so let me share my screen. All right, so basically, and please interrupt me because now I can't see the chat. So if anyone's trying to get attention, just, I initially, obviously it's bad to, permit a hazard where users can like inadvertently ship bugs. And that was the intent behind us creating exports as well as main, such that like one specifier couldn't diverge and resolve into a different file, whether it was CommonJS or ESM. And we thought that was all well and good, and we thought that prevented the hazard. But then it came to our attention in the last 2 weeks that this supposed like solution where like we know people are still going to want to publish a package that has both CommonJS and ESM sources within it, because there's something like 300,000 such packages on the npm registry right now. So we're certainly not going to turn the tide against those. We know people are going to want to publish them, and they're going to want the ESM side, which is currently only usable by bundlers, to be used by Node once Node finally supports ESM syntax natively. So per the current docs, we recommend using an export or a deep import path, such as like /module, to go to this new ES module version of it. And we thought that would be great, that resolves this hazard, because it's not a divergent specifier, it's a completely different specifier, and so therefore, hazard averted. But what we kind of came to the realization of recently, and then I made a demo repo showing it, which is at the link here at the top, is that no, the hazard actually still is freaking present, even with this like /module or /CommonJS or whatever you call it approach, because the original dual package, so similar to the GraphQL, like the core GraphQL package in that example, say there's like a plugin for GraphQL, it's like GraphQL CommonJS plugin that does require GraphQL. And then there's some other plugin that's much newer and that does import GraphQL /module. Then in the end user's app, they import GraphQL CommonJS plugin, and import GraphQL ESM plugin, and bam, they've got the hazard. There's both copies of GraphQL end up getting loaded in their module graph. And if there's an instance of comparison, if there's shared state, if there's the plugins attaching to the original GraphQL singleton, all these things that were part of the dual divergent specifier hazard, they're all bam present again in this, what I'm calling now the dual package hazard. And so basically, this made me realize that if we truly want to prevent the hazard, I think the only way to do so is if a package can only exist as one type or another. So like if it has a type field or an implicit type field that if it lacks the type field, it's implicitly typed CommonJS, then it's like every JavaScript file in there has to be that type. And then people just won't be able to publish quote unquote dual packages where they're shipping CommonJS and ESM sources. That just wouldn't be usable in Node. But I went into some detail about like what that would really mean in practice, and I think it's not really feasible. Like people would find ways to work around it. You can always just require the path, like import or require /node module /package /something. So truly locking it down and preventing the hazard may not be possible, or it's at least on the verge of being a fool's errand. So I'm sort of personally, I feel like if we can't prevent it, then we might as well just allow it and give people what they want, and then adopt conditional exports. So I'm going to stop talking, and then Miles, if you want to.
Yeah, Jan has their hand up.
Yeah, just to amend because somebody brought it up. Creating a copy and publishing under different package names, so Lodash and Lodash-ES, has exactly the same problem. Basically, as long as there are two versions of the package in the ecosystem under whatever name or specifier, and they share an ecosystem of consumers, you have this problem. So basically, if you actually want to remove this issue, whatever shared package is in the ecosystem, GraphQL, ESLint, whatever, would have to publish a new major version, completely drop CommonJS support whatsoever, and only ship ESM. That is the only way to actually remove this hazard, as far as I can tell. At least I haven't heard any alternative that would actually remove the hazard.
Yeah, and I'll add my bit here. As one of the people who is probably the most bullish on ban the hazard, enough so that I pushed for the other pattern that arguably now creates a different but similar hazard. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and a lot of time kind of coming to terms with it. And I think like one of the biggest things for me with this as well is kind of finding the balance here between developer experience and foot guns. And I realize as someone who's championed top level 08, maybe you can't take me too seriously on that. But jokes aside, when I was under the impression that splitting up, like that having two separate entry points would hide the hazard, or at least make it more explicit and require more work, I really didn't think that the developer experience of like a single entry point was worth it. And I pushed extremely hard, for example, that changing a package to ESM should be semver major, or there shouldn't be ways of moving this forward. But in reality, and to Jan's point, the problem is much more subtle, and it's in this, like, similar to what we have now, in the sense that, like, even if you are importing a module that is ESM, if it's subdependency, like think of something like GraphQL, and you might use a whole bunch of different adapters and plugins. Like by the time you start introducing a handful of different plugins into your stack, and they just work, because, for example, you can import the default from CommonJS, to consumers of these packages, where those packages are then in turn actually requiring the thing that may have separate entry points, there may be no obvious way to those individuals to know that the hazard is happening if it's hidden underneath them. And that's kind of independent of whether or not like the single specifier can mean multiple things. And I think the real solution here overall is educating people about best practices around utilizing singletons in Node. This is even for things that are all ESM or all CommonJS, not only things that are dual packages. The kind of things that we're having problems with right now are all around the singleton problem. And whether or not the solution to this is like pitching more dependency injection patterns, or whether or not the solution here is, pitching patterns on the like global this that allows people to like, share a cached entry. I think that no matter what we choose, we need to educate people on the best practices of this. And the developer experience difference between having this feature and not having this feature is so massive. And since we arguably need to do all of this education anyways, it feels kind of spiteful, or rather like it feels like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, for lack of a better analogy, to just nix this hazard. And again, I say that as taking a 180 on my prior stance, and it's taken me a while to get here. Guy, you have your hand up.
Yeah, just to follow up on that point of education, and I agree with all those points, and it was very well put, Miles. If you think about, as you say, that people want to get the superior experience of modules, and they want to be able to ship them, what we'll likely see is the largest JS libraries will do the dual mode pattern in a safe way. They'll do wrappers and things like that, and they'll adopt it in a way, as long as we can clearly communicate this way of doing things and make sure it's very clear in the docs, and all the main libraries can follow it, which they will, because if they don't, they'll get bug reports and they'll very quickly switch to handling their state in shared modules. So the main libraries will do it. The issues will be those libraries on the edges that didn't necessarily see the standard way of doing things, or follow what the best way of doing things is. So it's, in a sense, getting on top of it and communicating it is a better way to help the ecosystem towards good practice, as opposed to just letting this organic bulldozer of JavaScript devs do all these other things. And also, most devs will copy what the main libraries are doing, or see those patterns happening anyway. So ideally, if there's an endorsed pattern and we can get behind it and push it, that'll guide the ecosystem towards a better outcome. It's also worth bearing in mind that this is a temporary state of affairs. Temporary as in a few years, but the problem will become less pronounced as you gradually use less and less CommonJS code in your application.
One thing I'd like to add to what Guy said, hilariously, an argument that I had used in the past about why we shouldn't do this was presenting all of the open source projects that had lots of issues about this, from Webpack to GraphQL to Create React App. They all got kind of bit by the specifier hazard, had lots of issues opened, and I was kind of holding that up as an example of like why this is such a problem and we shouldn't allow it. And kind of in retrospect, and kind of, I think I hinted at this, that actually could be a feature, in the sense that, like, yes, while these problems can be very subtle, a lot of the times they're experience breaking it. So what I mean by this is that for the larger ecosystem packages that will run into this, I think that if they are publishing packages that have the hazard and are biting people, people will find out pretty quickly open issues, and this should be fixed.
Wes, were you able to turn on your mic, or did you have anything to say?
Still trained. So Wes had said, babbling your output and having dual entry points for your ESM source and CJS output is the pit of failure. It literally encourages the singleton failure mode. That's why we must encourage wrapper approaches, is what Guy responded. And I guess, like, Wesley, with that as well, like, if we're talking about the singleton hazard, like, one of the approaches in which, I've thought of as a potential solution is you could have a single CommonJS module inside of your package with its only export being a symbol. You can look at the global this object with that symbol to see if anything is on it, as like kind of a lazy load that happens the first time you try to run the function. and the CommonJS version or the ESM version can append the object there. And if the sources, are pretty much identical, like you will get just kind of one instance, and it's a way in which we could mirror the cache. Another thing that I guess we could look into, actually, maybe this is an API that we could look into, is what if there's an API that we could add to Node to manually register the module in another cache?
You're saying like a way to essentially explicitly make the require and ESM versions of a thing the same?
Yes.
At runtime?
Yes.
Wouldn't that need to be done as part of a loader?
Well,
you could already do that now, right? If you like found a way to get require.cache into an ESM module, which I don't know if if you have to, anyway, you find a way to get it in there, and then you just install your objects into the cache at the,
Miles, I feel like that's essentially that's saying you want to do require VSM, which obviously we've been talking about for a long time as the quote unquote other solution. But
this would be different than require VSM. So like let's think about it unidirectionally from ESM to require, which is a little different. And then we're at 152, so maybe we should time box this particular conversation to 2. But if we you can get, for example, you can create a require function. I think that you should be able to access the cache with that file. So in the ESM module, essentially right before you're exporting the main, you should be able to essentially take whatever you're about to export and register it into the CJS cache with the appropriate name, so that at a later point, if it is required, it would be loaded from that object. So you would only get one instance.
Guy is saying that can already be done using current APIs.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm saying is that is another possible way that we could document avoiding the hazard.
So if I could just reply, I have a PR up that's like a child of the conditional exports PR, where I go into fairly great length about recommended patterns for dual packages. And the first recommended one is the ESM wrapper approach. That is the safest, because then there is only one singleton that's shared between both, which I think is kind of the same thing as what you're describing, Miles. I don't know. And then the second one is lots of ways to avoid having statefulness within a package is the kind of the second approach. We can continue obviously to improve those docs and make it better and more, patterns and suggested, etc. But I don't think there's any controversy there. I think it's more of can we reach a consensus on permitting the hazard in general? Obviously, we'll educate the hell out of everybody if we do permit it.
Jan has their hand up.
Yeah, so what I wanted to add is that I personally believe that the singleton hazard is important, but does not affect most of the packages, which colors my opinions on some of this, which is to say that I believe for many packages, it will in practice be perfectly fine to just publish a CommonJS and an ESM build independently using Babel, and it will actually be fine. Because in most cases, that package will be used once or twice in the app, if that. So most likely once. And in that case, it will only pick one of the 2 builds per application, which means there aren't really 2 instances or 2 copies in a build. Because the problem is with the wrapper approach for many libraries, people will then not use that library if it doesn't pre-shake as well, because any transition in Webpack from non-pre-shaken to from non-CommonJS to CommonJS means that it's bailing out on all kinds of optimizations. So I believe that for most packages, what they will do pretty rightfully is that they ship a CommonJS and ESM build using Babel. They are just a bunch of utility functions or classes. They will be used once in a project. So that project will use one, but not the other. And it's just a matter of supporting different kinds of projects. So I think that in practice, for most of that long tail that we talked about earlier, they will be fine. The dual specifier hazard or the dual instance hazard will not actually affect them. They will not actually load to different copies in practice.
Okay, so I think that we've done a good job of kind of talking through the specifier hazard specifically. I'd like to suggest that we move on to discuss the conditional exports proposal. Does anyone have any concerns with that? Okay, cool.
Well, I mean, I guess there's really two decisions to be made. One is like, do we want to allow the hazard or not? The second is, if we allow the hazard, do we want to allow it through conditional exports? So are we assuming we have consensus then that we're okay with allow? I mean, we already allow the hazard in the status quo, so I assume we're okay with that. And then it's just a question of, do we want to permit conditional exports, I guess. Is that fair to say?
I'd like to avoid flipping into the consensus, like trying to get yet. I think it'd be good for us to talk through these issues first and then flip modes into consensus seeking about like those block of issues that we have.
Okay, fine. Unless
anyone, would prefer. But I think we're having like really productive discussions, so I don't want it to degrade. So conditional exports proposal, Guy, would you like to present this?
Sure. I don't have any screen sharing to provide for this, but the best place to get a good picture of it, I think the PR is not a very good description, unfortunately. But yeah, so extending the exports proposal so that you can, instead of just mapping to a single string, which corresponds to a module within the package, you can map to an object, which then names different entry points in the package that can be selected based on kind of condition rules. And this grew out of quite a few previous proposals. It's something had in various forms over the years. The most recent version of it was a package targets proposal, which we were thinking of doing in userland, and I was discussing it with Rollup and Parcel. And then when we sort of saw that there was crossover with this dual specifier thing, that it is itself a condition, it seemed like a great opportunity to actually bring this feature in, which might simplify a lot of existing use cases. The main use case that it builds off of is trying to support the thanks, Jeffrey. Trying to support the browser field in Node.js, and thinking about how the browser field might interact with exports. And then there are also other environments like Electron. I know Electron has some complexities because it's got a different render environment and things like that. So it might be Electron render or whatever. But it's up to those environments in a flexible way that they can define and say, I will first pick the browser condition, or a tool can say, I'm going to first pick the browser condition, then I'm going to pick the module condition, then I'm going to pick the default condition. The only thing that's really enforced is that everything picks the default condition last. Apart from that, it's up to the environment, and it could even be customizable by a flag or something like that. And then it kind of opens up a space for different environments and different tools to be able to state their needs. And what's nice about it is it's statically analyzable in build tools. You're able to very easily optimize for just the environments that you're targeting. And so it's kind of a tooling feature as well. And Wes just pointed out that the module condition is a different type of condition. Every other condition is a constant of the environment. If it's your tool, your runtime, your linter, or whatever, you kind of have this constant conditions, and there's a set order, and it's a constant. It doesn't change. It doesn't vary. Whereas the module condition, because it opens up the dual specifier, has it is this one exception of a condition that is different between the resolver for CommonJS and the resolver for ES modules. I think it would be a very useful feature for tooling. Devin just commented on the PR and was very supportive of it, which was nice to see. If we were to ship such a thing and tools adopted it, great. If we were to ship such a thing and tooling ignored it, because modules are experimental, we could always effectively decide to deprecate it if people aren't using it. So the way I feel about it is, it's quite a big feature. It's incredibly useful. I've been using variants of this feature for many years, and it would be great to see it help simplify tooling, help simplify these things. And the way I feel about it is that we should just put it out there and as an experimental unflagged implementation. And if we get positive feedback, we know we've done a good thing. If we don't get any feedback, or if we don't get usage, it's always something that can be deprecated. So I don't think we should feel like it's an all or nothing. I feel like it's a great to have, and it could simplify things quite significantly.
Okay. Does anybody have anything to add here for right now? Any questions? I know, like, one thing that was brought up, that you know, the default, and like, I'd be really interested. I guess I got to dig through this a little bit more about, like, so we're talking about supporting 3 potential conditions in Node: module, node, and default. I will avoid with bike shedding over those names, although at a later point in time, I look forward to bike shedding over the names. But I do think, like, from a semantic standpoint, like, default, I'm assuming, is just like what it goes to if there's nothing else. But kind of teasing apart the difference between default, node, and module as 3 explicit things. I just find it a little bit confusing. So that is one part of the proposal I would like for us to tweak a little bit more. Guy, you have your hand up.
Yeah. So to try and clarify that a little bit, I would almost be incredibly tempted not to document the node condition at all, to ship it silently and not document it anywhere or even tell anyone that it's supported. One of the main reasons for having the node condition is if, like, I'm of the opinion, and it's controversial, I don't know if it's true, but I think there's a good chance that, like, this node monoculture that we have isn't going to last. And we're going to end up in a future where we have lots of different disparate JavaScript environments. And I don't know if that'll happen, but if it does, we'll want a node condition to still select node when it is no longer the monoculture. While it remains the monoculture, you always want to use default because, well, we always want to use default because if there are any other environments, then they will always work. So that's the main reason. And I wouldn't go so far as removing the node condition because I think it's a useful way to support other environments in future.
Jan, and then Jordan, and then I have something to add.
Yeah. Wouldn't remove the node condition. All right. I disagree somewhat for the exact reason that I don't believe that we are currently in a situation where node is a monoculture. What I mean by that is there's the browser, there's React Native, and there is, I think, Electron in many cases. that have certain APIs, like for example, fetch, that I would consider more standard than requiring HTTP. So for me, if you write a module that requires or imports HTTP, you should mark that with a node guard. Because for me, default is for portable code that should not depend on APIs that are basically restricted to one specific runtime. That might be controversial, but so for me, Node is very important to document because I think modules that use Node-specific APIs should call themselves out if it makes sense at all.
So, Jordan, you're next.
Yeah, so, okay. I agree with what Jan's saying, but then the second question is, I was really confused by what Guy was saying because maybe I'm misunderstanding. If I wanted to make a specifier that can be both imported and required, don't I have to specify Node if it's not the main?
Default is the main. So browser is a more specific condition which picks out of the default. And that way.
Right, but I mean, I'm not talking about multiple
Electron.
environments. I'm saying just within Node. If I want to import feature module, import whatever the name of this package is, import package/feature or require package/feature, how do I designate which one is the ESM implementation?
The ESM code would be under module and the CommonJS code would be under default.
Ah, okay. Thank you. Then yeah, in that case, I think I think Guy's point about how if there ever is something else that's viable to use besides Node, it would be useful to have already had the Node condition. And because of Jan's point, I think we definitely should document it. And yeah, I think it's for the same reason browser is practical, Node is practical. And even if there is never any other alternative, whether there will be or not is a different discussion, but even if there's never another one, it still seems useful to be explicit and call that out.
So I'll add a bit, and then Jan has their hand up after me. I think for the sake of time, for what it's worth, I don't think we have the time today to work through and get the specifics of this, like which entry points Node should support by default and what they should be called explicitly. I do feel like this needs a little bit more workshopping, even if we land on exactly what we have today. And when we try to reach consensus later, like part of what I would like to propose for this is kind of us reaching consensus on the behavior that we would like conditional exports to have, what we want to work towards, but still give us a little bit of time to work through this and have some more discussions around it, just because we really haven't. And I think that if we can hopefully get through a whole bunch of the other consensus discussions, we can maybe shift and focus on this and other things like JSON modules. And like as a group, I think there's still a whole laundry list of things that we could be working on. But anyways, I think that perhaps for the purpose of consensus today, it might make more sense to focus on the capabilities and the higher level feature and try to reach consensus on that. Jan, your hand is up.
Yes. Sorry. Still learning to unmute and then lower my hand so I don't forget to lower my hand. All right. The one thing that I wanted to note, and that goes towards my point earlier, that I think default should be the portable code. I believe quite strongly that we shouldn't have a module guard, but we should have a require guard. And I know that Guy made that change for very specific reasons, like to make sure that we can have a flag that potentially disables the divergent resolution. But I think even with a require guard, you can have such a flag because you can basically say that the import resolution uses the require guard in that mode, and then you have still a single resolution. I think that the default should point to something that is portable, and CommonJS is generally speaking not portable, or at least not compliant with standard JavaScript.
I can get behind that, Jan, if that's something that you would like to see. The switch from require to module was exactly because we were worried about the consensus, and it was a way to allow conditionally disabling it so it would fall back to the default CommonJS version. But we can certainly bring that discussion up again. It seems to fit Miles's point that this isn't necessarily something we need to get agreement on now, though.
Yeah, so if everyone's okay with it, I feel like we've now talked through all of the kind of like the remaining features enough that we can maybe shift modes, because feels to me like we have a good wide coverage of like what the things are. Does anyone object to us moving forward and talking a little bit about reaching consensus? Okay, cool. So thanks everyone for that. I'm gonna delete this one from the agenda. Let's go to unflagging. So oh yeah. Sorry, this got kind of mixed up a bit. I'm gonna just kind of copy. Oh, okay, I see what happened. Sorry, just give me 1 second. If people could just hold off on editing the doc for 1 second.
Sorry.
No problem. Okay, I think we've got some good teamwork going on. I think we're close. Okay. Awesome. Okay, cool. Sorry, I just kind of lost track for a second. So for reaching consensus, the first thing that we talked about, and I think at the base of it, the number one thing that I think we need to decide on as a group right now, that in turn will kind of affect all of the rest of the decisions that we make, is the divergent specifier hazard. So just like really first off, and I think that we may, I don't know, let's see where we get. Does anyone object to us moving forward with the agreement that we're going to allow the hazard? So allowing a single specifier to be overloaded to have, potentially different different sources that are served based on the loader. So the ability, like the functionality that conditional mapping and the conditional exports proposal will give, so that if you required a specifier and imported a specifier, you will get two different source texts and two different instances. Wesley, so this is specifically, let me even make it more specific. Do we want to allow dual mode modules?
I mean, we have them now.
If you had asked me 8 months ago, before we had decided to table talking about extension resolution for two reasons, only one of which I found compelling, which was the specifier hazard, I would have said, yes, this is something we should look into because a lot of people in the community are doing it this way and maybe it can work out for us. However, arguments have been presented in those 8 months that seem to make this a pretty damning thing to do, and have convinced me over that time that we should not be pursuing or encouraging it in any way whatsoever. I don't know why y'all were willing to make such a rapid about face on it, just because someone pointed out that, oh man, if you go through an extra hoop, you can still get a kind of similar problem. And like, that's enough to make you completely say, oh, well, then we should encourage it. But I still don't find that a compelling enough situation to be a reversal for me.
So Wesley, are you formally objecting to this?
Well, yeah, like the weight of like, I understand why this is useful, but like the arguments were laid out over the last 8 months why this was a problem, to the point where I don't believe we should be encouraging or adding patterns that like set users up for failure in this way in any way. Like, education be damned. Like, you can tell people all you want, but if you're actually actively introducing features that make you more likely to encounter the problem, that's a flaw in the design, and that's not something we should introduce from the start.
To be clear, though, that it's only certain programming patterns that will make it more likely for this to happen. And I think a lot of the arguments over the last 8 months have been coming from...
And that's exactly what makes it so insidious. And that's what was said in a lot of the arguments that were made over the last 8 months. Like, yes, even within a single package, you still have to use state to encounter the problem. And how likely is that? Ha, ha, ha. But it's a really big problem, because when you do encounter it, you won't have encountered it before, quite probably. And it'll be a pain to debug and waste many developer hours.
Jan?
Right. So I definitely understand where you come from, right? So this has been a staple of this group that for the longest time, up until a week or two ago, maybe a month ago, everyone was firmly on the side of, no, this is a deal breaker. We cannot have this kind of issue in the ecosystem. The problem is that nobody wanted the alternative, or at least I now consider the only alternative, which is nobody can ever maintain a package where the same major version is available both for CommonJS consumption and ESM consumption, which I don't think is a worthwhile trade-off. We thought we had an alternative that got us around the problem, the /ESM hack, right? We thought, hey, this is a way that we can not have this problem at all, but people can still maintain one major version that supports existing CommonJS consumers, but also exposes ESM. It's great, it works. Well, we figured out it doesn't actually work, at least not reliably. Actually, we still have the same issues, maybe even worse, because now it's a lot harder to resolve, because you can no longer fix that one package. You now have to fix tens of packages if you actually want to resolve the issue, because by default, the issue is now distributed across an ecosystem instead of being focused in one single point. So what we thought was a way around the hazard actually turned out to be an even worse version of the hazard. So now the alternative is not, hey, the consumers have to add a /ESM to their requires. The alternative now is suddenly, well, either we have a dual instance hazard, or nobody can ever publish a package that is available as native ESM while also supporting a CommonJS in the same major version. And that is no longer, the trade-off changes, right? The calculation changes, at least for me. For me, suddenly it falls clearly on the side of, well, we will have the hazard, because the ecosystem will not accept that it's impossible to ship ESM while also supporting a CommonJS consumer.
Okay, but
and
hear
if
me
the
out.
ecosystem cannot accept that, then we have the hazard. And so now the question is, can we make it safer, more easy to use, so that people at least have a chance of finding out about the feature, or have something that they can Google for, instead of just patterns that widely sprout out in the ecosystem because every single JS developer in the world is trying to figure out how to do it.
Okay, but hear me out. Like, this doesn't remove the specifier hazard as you've described it before in any way. It still exists in full. It doesn't actually make anything better in that regard. It just makes it so that package authors have another avenue in which they can potentially do something very wrong. And then on top of that, like,
can I respond to that, please? I've been waiting for a bit. It's not very wrong. More than a third of all packages on the NPM registry use the module field. Like
right,
300,000
the module
plus.
field does not work like this.
Please wait. Like hundreds of thousands of packages are published where people are shipping ESM and CommonJS files within the same package, even if they're not currently meant to be run within the same runtime. I think it's far too broad a brush to say that like people are going to be okay with just not shipping dual packages, or that they'll accept that you think it's a bad idea and therefore they're, you know, not going to do it. Like it's never been an okay thing. Like from the beginning, we've talked about how we need to make the transition possible. We need to, you know, have a way that people can transition from an all CommonJS world to an ESM world, and that dual packages were part of that. Like it's a very core like user story and feature request from users that we really need to respect and ship. And like if we're not going to provide it, we need a really good reason to do so. And I'm not hearing a good reason other than you thinking that for some packages, some of the time, it's an issue, so therefore no one can ever deal with it, even if they aren't writing the type of package where this is relevant.
No, what I'm saying is this isn't the way to do it. So first of all, to counter exactly one of your points, the module field works very differently than this, because the module field doesn't change its behavior based on the package that calls into that package, all right? Your bundler just always uses the module field if it's present and then falls back to the CommonJS field. That's a very, very different behavior. It affects the resolution of the entire tree, all right? Now, more importantly, I do get behind enabling that use case. What I don't get behind is doing it in this fashion. I would be much, much happier if we said, if you want to ship ESM and support CommonJS consumers, then you have to opt in with this preload flag. And then that gets you CommonJS usage of your package, because you've acknowledged the fact that, yes, there are downsides. I know what those downsides are, and I've toggled a flag to say, load me in CJS anyway. That I consider to be a much better solution, all right? Like, miles better than.
I don't consider that to be any different than using conditional exports. Conditional exports is just as explicit that you're explicitly saying.
No, but the thing about conditional exports is it doesn't remove any of the problems. The thing about the preload flag, right? The only problem that it adds is potentially the execution ordering problem, because you're preloading the package, right? You're loading it before you load everything else to put it in the cache. But
if it's a per package preloader, does that not mean that you have to glob your node modules folder to determine which packages require preloading?
I mean, this doesn't exist. There's no PR for this. Just like require VSM doesn't exist.
No,
so
but
saying that you're blocking conditional exports because there's some other theoretical solution, I just don't buy it. Like, enough time has gone by. I'm not really willing to wait for a potential other solution to someday maybe surface, and that maybe will work. Maybe we'll be spec compliant. Maybe that will find consensus. Like,
when we first started this group, I sat down and I said, I was going to sit here and I was going to say that I did not want to ship something that I felt was incomplete or substandard and would not satisfy all of the use cases that people needed. This I consider to be substandard. You can disagree with me on that. And we do disagree on that right now. And that's fine.
I just don't think it's practical for startup time to allow packages to require globbing and also require that they execute code that the consumer doesn't necessarily have control over. A lot of server applications are startup time critical, and especially do a lot of lazy loading techniques.
I mean, so the
far more dangerous feature for the ways that people want to use Node.js.
I think the preload flag is more about saying that you can execute this entire ESM graph and then let it be done once you first encounter it. Less so about actually trying to find everything at boot. But again, that's something that we haven't encountered because we've encountered this solution. Right. We've identified the problems with it, and right. And we are currently saying that the hazards that we have here are more acceptable than the hazards we have in the other one. And I'm saying I disagree with that. Like, I would much rather investigate alternatives than proceed with this based on the
We've
discussions we've had over the
spoken a
last 8
lot
months.
about out of order, require, and import.
Yes.
I mean, that was one of the things that we spoke about a lot at the beginning, was that if you require, if require is going to behave differently after you run import against the same module than if you haven't already run import against the same module. You've now introduced non-determinism into your application loaders, and that's a non-starter.
And loading 2 different copies of your program and introducing non-determinism that way isn't?
It's perfectly deterministic.
I think one of the bigger differences too here, Wes, like at least to what I was trying to suggest before, was identifying patterns that people may be likely to use and making better APIs for them. So I think the example of, documenting the way, like it's already possible today to put a cache item from the ESM, from a package that's running in the ESM loader, to append something into the CommonJS loader if it doesn't exist already. Yes, that may create race conditions. So like a great example is like with the post-order traversal. If a deeper module used require to get a resource that you then are later importing somewhere else in the graph, like this could create really, really weird stuff happening. And because of that, I think it's absolutely fine to document and give APIs that allow people to manually do this. Although I do think that doing this in a way that would be kind of automatic or magic would not really get through with core. Another thing that I think is very much worth considering here, with a bunch of the different ideas that we've put forward, require ESM as well as the autoload stuff. I don't think that we should underestimate how much Node cares about startup time and the cost of startup time. And just because we have an idea of something we think we can do, there's an extremely high likelihood that anything that hurts startup time and anything that slows down the runtime in any measurable way will get significantly rejected upstream. That was one of the reasons why we had to remove the proxies from the built-in APIs and introduce an API to like manually sync them. I think that's another great example of something where it's like we can educate people and give them the tools to do it, but that's like obviously a huge environment mismatch and foot gun. If someone imports a built-in module, then requires it, then the require polyfills or instruments it, and then when you access it again in the ESM world, like it will not have those updates unless you run that very specific API. I think that our entire implementation ends up being a big compromise between developer experience, usability, and correctness, because we're absolutely not working in a vacuum. And like the massive refactors that Guy had to do to the Bootstrap because introducing promises like broke async hooks in a whole bunch of weird ways, I also think really speaks to how big the system is that we're trying to make these changes into. And I do think that we need to be very realistic about the scope of where we can solve these problems and the scope of, where we really don't have insight. Like, I'm not even saying this is 100% the case, but like, I'm pretty sure the lookup in the export map to hit a particular key for a CommonJS module is not going to introduce any sort of major noticeable slowdown as compared to main or export maps as a whole in the way in which we were talking about doing this. But we don't even have any guarantee until we go to unflag it upstream in core that like there won't be folks from upstream who will object to that. So we can work towards reaching consensus here. But like something that we have not spoken too much about on this call is things being palpable to core and core's mission of having a fast runtime, and being aware that that is actually one of the largest stakes that could stop us from being successful with something.
Right, and this is like a huge barrier towards having a fast runtime because it encourages patterns where you're going to have multiple copies of your code loaded into the tree at the same time and executed. Like, it might not be immediately visible in startup, but the costs are likely to be even larger in a real application.
That's just wrong. Like, conditional exports no more encourage that than the /module or /CommonJS approach. They're the same thing. It's just a question of how users define them in package.json.
Right.
Either way,
that's why I am dissatisfied with all of our approaches where the ultimate solution is to ship 2 copies of your code.
but
right?
that's what users will do, whether we want them to or not, whether you like it or not. That's what they have been done. Hundreds of thousands of packages are doing that.
And them shipping 2 copies of code is perfectly fine. The problem is Node reading 2 of them and executing 2 of them.
Well, Node supports CommonJS and ESM. That's what's going to happen. Like, I understand you don't like it, but like, that's what users want. We have to support it. They're already doing it.
So Guy has something to add, and then I want to time box this conversation to 4 more minutes. Guy?
Yeah, I just want to say in terms of expectation, I think most users naively will probably imagine that Node.js will just magically support the module field and always use that version. So that's the like naive expectation. And then when they realize it doesn't, they'll need something to replace that, and they will look for a solution. And I tend to agree with Jeffrey that it's like we either provide a solution or they will find a solution. Unfortunately, this is JavaScript, and it's a wild ecosystem.
So I'm going to ask this question one more time, and please, everyone, feel free to voice your feelings on this. Does anyone object to allowing dual mode modules, specifically where one specifier can resolve to 2 different entry points, depending on if it's CommonJS or ESM?
My opinion has not been changed from the start of the discussion.
Okay, so with that said.
That wasn't an objection.
Yes, it is, to be explicit.
Okay. Yeah, let's not mince words, right? Even asking if there are objections, it was, I think, a formality that Miles asked. We know from the current discussion Wes objects, and that's okay. It's his right.
Yes. So
it's like you are welcome to decide that objection does not matter to the rest of the group, and that's fine. But I do dislike it.
Yeah. Well, I guess here's the thing that I'm going to lead that into now. So all of the other things that we kind of have on here to discuss, I believe, get derailed because if we skip all the way to unflagging, does dual mode modules block unflagging? And let's say, independent of whether or not we could subtly tweak timelines of things, just a quick question, does anyone object to us unflagging a version of modules that does not, at the very least, have dual modules solved eventually as like something we have consensus on?
Yes, I object to that.
Okay, so we have a deadlock here. And we have a deadlock that we will, after all the discussions that we've had here,
sorry, just for notes, that was Jordan, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
And then just to be explicit, solved eventually, like including the part Miles said about solved eventually. Like there has to be a concrete plan for solving dual mode modules, at the least.
Yeah, that was I was wording that explicitly for a reason. Maybe we'll get to that later. But very simply here, and I am not saying this to any particular person or saying any individual needs to budge, but it's very clear that we're at a deadlock. So I think we need to skip all the way forward to 2 different questions here. One is, what is the way in which we can move forward? And the other one is, how do we continue working together? So I think it is very clear, at least from the conversation that we're having today, there's other APIs we might be interested in exploring. Things upstream, such as JSON modules, are things that we actively want to explore and make sure are moving forward in the ecosystem. Things like WASI are moving forward. Like, there's going to be no shortage of work for modules for the foreseeable future. especially as we work towards having more things universal, or just Node being a modern runtime, import maps being an example of something else that, maybe we'd have bandwidth to solve once we get past initial things, loaders being another one. But we do have this impasse right now. We've managed to boil it down to one very specific thing, which is allowing dual mode modules. But if we have voices, and I think there potentially is even more than one voice who is objecting to this, we kind of have a couple different ways of moving forward. And perhaps we can focus on coming to consensus on that. One way in which we could move forward would be to institute a vote. I don't like the idea of a vote, but that's an option. That also is not an option that I think that we could do today. To do a vote and to do a vote properly, we need to set a time box on the vote. We need to query all members of the group, and we need to have enough votes that a majority of the votes are there. So I do guess that with 8 people on the call right now, we could, in theory, have 7 out of 14 votes. And if we get one more, even just through messaging some people, we could get a majority vote, which could allow us to move forward with the thing. I personally really don't want us to do that. Another option that we have, it's not documented in our governance, although with enough members on this call right now, we could decide the spirit of the governance and to document it later, would be to move forward with a concept of something like rough consensus. The idea here being, in general, and I will kind of ask this question generically. If we believe that we've really talked through this concept, to the end of its completion, that we're kind of where we're going to be, could we potentially get to a point where if someone is willing to say, I recognize that the group as a whole is mostly in this place, I feel like we've kind of talked this to an end, could we as a group come to the sense that we have a rough consensus about this and be, at least as a group, okay with moving forward with dual mode modules or without dual mode modules, without requiring a vote? Because, and I'm not saying that this would be the case, if we think it would be obvious that a vote would be able to be pushed through as a majority, I think it would be much better for us to reach some sort of degree of consensus around this, at least a rough consensus around this, so that I don't want anyone to feel singled out. I don't want people to feel railroaded. I don't want people to feel worked around. But the flip side is, if we do genuinely feel that we've kind of talked about this to the end, our kind of 3 options here are a vote, rough consensus, or shutting the group down. Because if we can't move forward, there's really nothing else for us to do.
Can I take another stab at a proposal for a compromise?
Sure.
So, Wes, I'm assuming obviously you don't like dual packages, but you're not objecting to what's already been merged in, right?
No, define what's already merged in, not the conditional export stuff.
If we were to unflag today with what's already merged into core.
If we were to unflag today, I would be okay with it because I believe what we have today can be mostly unchanged as we move towards something that is more complete and good. Yes.
Okay, so how about this? What if we here's one potential way forward. We could agree to unflag what we have now, potentially with, say, conditional exports also merged in, but behind its own flag, experimental conditional exports, say. Wes, if you're talking about preload, true, and other solutions, if those other solutions can come to fruition and become competing PRs within some allowable time frame, then they can get merged in under their own flags. And if there's consensus that those are better than conditional exports, we withdraw conditional exports because it never got unflagged. And the new thing, whether it's preload or something else, replaces it, that gets unflagged, and that's what we ship. But if there is no other alternative within whatever time limit we have, then conditional exports is the best we've come up with, and that's what gets unflagged, and that's the solution.
I mean, if you'd like to ask whether you can merge conditional exports behind a flag and then kick this can down the line until we want to unflag it, actually, and talk about and merge this discussion with the unflagging discussion later on, then we could have a more complete discussion then. I suppose so. Why not? Kick the can down the line. That works fine. But like, it's worth noting, if you are going to do that, again, I am actually perfectly fine with like the syntax. Like, Guy did convince me that the syntax is probably useful in the community, and so like having that part not be behind a flag and just the ability to like take an object that has like a main member, that seems fine. It is only with the resolver behavior that I take issue with.
Right, but that's the point of contention. Like, people.
Wait, hold on, Wes. Can I clarify that?
Yeah.
It sounds like you're saying that you would support the dual specifier thing for a main, but not for the other files in the package.
No. What I'm saying is so half of Guy's justification for the feature is that the new layout. So rather than it just being key of string to value of string or array of strings in the future, it's key of string to object or array of objects in the future, and then there's a known key in that object that we look up things for. That he has convinced me does have value.
You're supporting the schema, but not not more than one value in it.
Right, exactly. Because once you have the schema, you can allow third parties to add fields to it, like having a known place to have the browser field and other fields that actually supports export maps. And so I can understand that.
Clarifies it. Thank you.
Yeah, I can understand that, and that has value on its own, and you can merge that without a flag. That's fine. I'm very okay with that.
So, building on Jeffrey's excellent.
Can I reply to both Jeffrey's and yours, Miles, real quick? I know we have very little time. So for Miles, I think we can establish rough consensus even if we haven't yet agreed that that's our process, and that might be something we should do no matter what. Is just say like we have decided that this is what the rough consensus is, but we are, even if we haven't yet decided to move forward with it. And then for Jeffrey, I think that conceptually the way you described bringing things forwards works, but in the case of things that go out to the ecosystem like this, if people are either going to say that if conditional exports behind the flag means I cannot publish a package that uses it, which means there's no usage of it and no point in merging it, or they're going to publish it, which is going to constrain what we can do, what we can unflag later, because there will be packages in the ecosystem that have the conditional export syntax.
To that point, though, then that's just a question of like how long of a lead do we want to provide for alternatives to arise. So like if we say maybe the end of this year, like end of December or something like that, that's a really short period. So it's like either there's something else that comes up in the next month or two and we run with that instead, or we run with this. Either way, not that many people are going to want to publish dual packages like in the next 8 weeks or something like that. So they could just wait.
I very much disagree. I think the vast majority of the actively maintained packages are going to want to do that, and that there are going to be issues filed on every GitHub repo asking for it.
Not asking for something where people use this -- experimental, etc. flag. Like especially if the docs say that this is like subject to change, especially if syntax may change, people are going to hold off.
No,
but then we're not going to get the feedback that we'd want.
No, Jeffrey, the moment it's behind a flag and people start discussing it, there are going to be issues opened on it. We've had an issue to support MJS and TypeScript for 2 years now. So there you go.
I think oh wait, Guy, you have your hand up still? Nope.
Put it down.
So a quick thing to say here is independent of whether or not people use it or experiment with it, or they open issues on repos, people just say, I won't support it. I think that the contract that we have is very clear. If it's behind a flag, it is subject to extreme change. It will only be on node 13, which is a non-LTS node. I think it is, in my personal opinion, absolutely reasonable for us to change that at any point in the future. It is clear in the contract, and I don't think that even if people start shipping things that rely on it, I have no qualms in breaking that. That is the contract of the flag. And I think that, yes, if it's behind the flag, people will use it less. But if it's not able to be used at all, people will not be able to experiment with it at all. I think having ESM not behind a flag will have people playing with ESM in ways we never even imagined, because they will start using it en masse. It will start unlocking a whole bunch of stuff, and we never know what's going to come up. We have 15 minutes left, though. So I want to build on what Jeff suggested as a potential consensus that we could reach here, and suggest a path. And maybe we could reach consensus on it, which would be phenomenal. The path would be landing conditional exports behind a flag.
Can I just clarify that?
Yes.
As Wesley said, we could have conditional exports, but the specific module condition or require condition, depending on how myself and Jan work that one out, would be behind a flag in a way that is progressively enhanced.
So support,
you're saying like land the schema like behind the modules flag, and then land the additional values that Wes is objecting to behind a conditional exports flag. Is that what you're saying?
Right. So it'd be like a conditional dual.
Yeah.
Or what?
we only support by default or something like that.
Right. Or
Yeah, that would.
Node.js, depending.
Just initially, yeah.
Yeah, that way people can still have like the browser member or whatever other member they want. That way you can progressively support export maps with browser targeted stuff.
For the sake of time right now, I would like to separate those. I think that would be like, let's see first if we can get to consensus without landing any part of conditional exports. And then like,
or we can go backwards. If we don't, then we can check out condition behind a flag.
Yeah. I think, let me suggest something and then let's iterate on it if people are okay with that. So the full thing that I would suggest would be landing conditionals behind a flag. It can still be modified behind that flag to have multiple flags. Like we can figure all of that out separately. We unflag ESM with current implementation. We set a timeline. Oh yeah, and we also we do document conditionals as well as the hazards, as well as patterns for best practices of using them or not using them. We set a timeline. I would like to suggest end of January, mostly because we're getting into a slower time of the year. And I think 3 months is a fair amount of time, and we can revisit this at any point between now and then if we can reach consensus on it. So
what's the timeline for?
So if by the end of January, we are unable to find an alternative or an API that does not offer a solution that we can reach consensus on for dual modules, we move forward with dual modules.
But we would still be unflagged in the meantime.
I mean, rather than having that, rather than making that decision as to whether or not we move forward today, why don't we just say that we have make the final decision in 3 months? Because there's very little difference other than the fact that in the intervening 3 months, more people can be informed and we can make sure that everyone gets a say, because only 2/3 of the group is in today's meeting.
Jan, you have your hand up?
I just don't think there's much of a difference between the two, other than, advance warning.
I have a response to that if Jan, yours is thinking different.
Just quickly, yes, okay. Had to switch headphones. My concern about unflagging without a require guard or a module guard is that if people in the ecosystem start publishing packages, we will get in, if we have an unflagged implementation of modules, they will start publishing packages that work against that unflagged version of modules, extra module or not. So if they want to publish 2 different versions, they will pick up on things that have been published in the past about publishing something with /ESM. And I think that is worse than them not publishing anything at all.
I guess, Jan, the thing I would say to that, and then I guess it's Jeff and then Guy, is that yes, if they had the deep things, that wouldn't be great. They still need to worry about this hazard. We still need to educate them. And the introduction of those entry points in a couple months would be an incremental improvement that could land transparently. Jordan?
So yeah, I mean, I think what I heard out of what Jan was saying, or at least what I selected out of it, was if we, let's say we did that and we unflag modules and wait until January to unflag conditional exports, I would very much want, and would do this on my own anyway, Node's docs to strongly advocate against publishing ESM packages until this mechanism was there, because that creates you know, a ton of friction by not being backwards compatible. So like, I guess I don't see a ton of value as well in unflagging now if we can just unflag it in January or whenever. And I don't even know why we need that long. Like, why not till the end of the year or something? You know, 2 months seems like plenty of time, possibly even sooner. But like I guess that's what I'm concerned about, is the intervening time where people are going to publish, you know, like even if we tell them it's a December major, that just means that they're going to they're going to be, you know, working on a V3 of their package, and then all the users stuck on V2 are not going to, you know, who are using LTS or whatever, are not going to receive updates because package maintainers aren't super responsible about backporting things. Like, that's essentially what I'm concerned about, that scenario.
Guy?
So kind of on that point, the fact that people are already putting MJS files in packages, well, they have been for a long time. People are already putting type module in packages. They're doing a lot of things, and they're trying to get on board with best practices today. And without modules being unflagged, we're actually steadily heading towards a situation in which we're going to have frictions anyway, because people are doing a whole bunch of things where they want to do something, they know they have to do something, and they're doing things that may not necessarily work. And we're going to hit a situation where, unless we unflag very soon, you know, already from the fact that we missed the 12 LTS 13 release, it's already been clear that that's broken expectations of users, and it's set a kind of a thinking that, you know, are we not making progress as a group? And I think it's absolutely critical that we do unflag within a month. And I think it's a very good compromise to consider flagging dual mode. I would like us to still consider unflagged as experimental. I think there is actually less risk in shipping it and saying it's experiment. It's still experimental, but it's unflagged, because people will then know that they can get involved and give feedback. If you look at how little user feedback we've got, it's because it's still been behind this flag. And so it'll be great to open up that period. My idea would be shipping conditional exports. As I say, it can still be experimental, and then it allows a way to progressively enable dual mode. It'll be great if we could see if we have rough consensus on that.
I think something that's also worth considering here, Node 14 will be going LTS, like it is an LTS version. Node 14 gets cut in, I think it's April or March. Let me just double check here. And I think that it would be Node 14 gets cut in April. And I think that it would be in everyone's best interest that, you know, if we want to work towards stabilizing in 14, that we should have everything unflagged with a bit of time leading up to 14, so that, you know, any large changes that we need to make can mostly be worked through. We have 5 minutes left. I want to go through this one more time. And if we cannot reach consensus on this one thing, I think we need to punt until next week's meeting. And then I think that if we are unable to reach consensus by the end of next week's meeting, we may have to think of more drastic measures. But again, I would like to suggest, and if anyone has an alternative set of things, please feel free to add it. Landing conditionals behind a flag, unflagging ESM with the current implementation, with proper documentation of conditionals, hazards, patterns to use, have a timeline with the end of January to move forward with dual mode modules. If we do not have any alternative that seems to be, looking like something we would do, unflag conditionals without dual mode as soon as possible. Try to reach consensus on that. I actually think that we probably can reach that consensus rather quickly, especially if we only expose the default. But I just want to decouple that from unflagging the main implementation. Does anybody object to this specific plan? Going once? Going
To
twice?
clarify, your plan is to get consensus on that plan.
Yes.
Right. Cool. So we're not
How
objecting
about-
to consensus. We're objecting on your plan to get it.
Yes. If there are
I
no
thought this is the consensus.
Yes. So I am asking if there is objections to this plan. If we have no objections right now, we can move forward with landing conditionals. We can, behind a flag, we can move forward with documenting the hazards and patterns, and we can have a flag to, or we can have a PR to unflag modules, this week. Does anybody object?
And then just to, again, to clarify, is there a concrete deadline for conditional exports?
End of January. The only reason
So-
I'm making it as long is because with Thanksgiving and the Christmas holidays and New Year's, I just want to be fair to people and give them an opportunity of amount of time. Now, for what it's worth, this is the consensus that we're reaching today. If we can reach consensus earlier, then we can do it earlier. This is a deadline.
Okay, so I'm going to restate. You want to unflag modules in Node 13 only this week,
Yes.
and then you're saying, and you want to ship conditional exports behind a conditional exports flag, soonish, presumably this week, and then at the end of January, if we have not yet come up with a different alternative or a better alternative, we're going to remove the conditional exports flag.
Yep. And we can reach consensus on anything else between now and then.
Right.
So this can change. For example, I think that we maybe have consensus on conditional exports, but not on dual modules. So we can land that with a default. I want to decouple those from the unflagging because I think that we can explore those spaces separately. Okay.
I
Just to
mean-
clarify, that is landing is unflagging, but not removing experimental warnings and stuff.
Oh, 100%. This is still experimental. It's only on 13. And I think that we should separately in a follow-up conversation talk about our backporting plans for 12.
Yeah, I mean, and we can talk about that later, but I'd prefer not to backport to 12 until we have a dual package solution.
Yep, and I think that that similarly is another avenue for us to look at.
I mean, provided that in 3 months from now, we don't just quietly do something without discussing it with the group first, I think that's fine.
Yeah, I think we need
I think we could still have our meetings, etc. Sure.
Yeah. What I like about this solution, it allows us to move forward. We have not had to result to votes. We have not resulted in derailing anything, and we leave design space open to explore new things. Guy, you have your hand up?
Can I raise that and request that we make conditional exports unflagged, but the dual mode specifier itself flagged, assuming that we're finished this first one?
Yeah,
So
that's fine with me still. Yeah.
what
That would be great.
are you imagining
Like
with the default?
Right, so just the default and possibly the node condition, but for that to be fleshed out in GitHub.
I'm okay with that as long as we can reach consensus upstream. But I would.
Can I amend that slightly?
Yeah.
If we don't reach consensus on whatever we name these fields or something like if that breaks down somewhere, then we just ship the whole thing behind the flag, and we at least have consensus for that. But if there's more consensus to ship part of it unflagged, sure. But if that consensus fails, then we at least ship the whole thing behind its flag.
Sounds good.
So Guy, just as a clarification, we will work on GitHub to reach consensus on that PR. No one blocks it if there isn't dual mode. But if we can't reach consensus upstream on it, for whatever reason, that will not block unflagging modules. Are you okay with that?
Yes, if we cannot achieve that, then we can flag conditional exports entirely as its own feature.
Whew! I think we did it. A round of applause, everyone.
Thank you, Miles.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for being flexible and open. This has obviously been a heated discussion and a long path, and I'm really glad that we were able to reach a path that we could all agree upon. That makes me really happy. I also think perhaps I'll add an agenda item. I think that if we unflag, we should consider chartering. But let's follow up with that next Wednesday.
Thanks.
Okay. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.